advanced than Dr. Felipe's.
Niloy Claudio is an intellectual and cultural historian of the Philippines and an associate professor at UC Berkeley, University of California at Berkeley, where he also serves as faculty chair of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies. His award-winning book, Liberalism and the Post-Colony, examines state building in the 20th century Philippines. And he's also the author of Jose Rizal, Liberalism and the Paradox of Coloniality. His forthcoming book with Cornell University Press.
It's out.
Oh, it's out.
Yeah.
It's out. Congratulations. What's it called?
The Profligate Colonial.
The Profligate Colonial, okay. It traces the colonial roots of economic conservatism in the Philippines. And finally, your moderator for today is Richard Haderian.
It's okay, you can just say a vlogger, and I'm just gonna host it. I'm the fly on the wall now. Marina, thank you.
It's a bit of a change for you, right? Okay, take it away. We all know who Richard Haderian is, and also this is being recorded. But for privacy purposes, if you don't want to be in the video, I think the line will be
we'll just turn off the
and
audience part,
it's not the camera's not directed towards you.
Yeah.
Okay, so Richard will take over and we'll have a Q&A, definitely have a Q&A session after the speakers say their piece.
Hello, is this working? I'm sorry. Thank you so much again, Bambina, for making this happen. Again, advance apology that this was totally accidental. We have another manual, but we're fixing that. We'll make sure there'll be all series of different conversations later this year. So this is kind of a sequel to the previous conversation we had last year, especially the one we had on corruption. And the whole point of these kinds of conversations is to have a safe space to really think outside the box. I think whether you look at the situation internationally, whether you look at the situation regionally and also nationally, I think all of us realize that we're entering a new age of disruption, right? So you want to understand the lay of the land. You don't want to miss the forest for the trees, but you also don't want to lose track of some of the trees there, that, monstrous trees there that would bring down the whole house, right? So the whole point of this conversation is to open up really a bigger conversation about not only what's happening to the Philippine economy, but what should happen to the Philippine economy, as we also discuss later on presidential polls. We're going to have panels about who could be the next president of the Philippines, what kind of characteristics we're looking for, and importantly, what kind of policy agenda the next Filipino president has to have in mind to deal with all of the systemic problems we're facing. So in order to have really that kind of outside the box authoritative conversation, I really couldn't think of a better panel than the three excellent gentlemen next to me. So a historian, a banker, an economist, what else can you ask for? So to get the ball rolling, maybe I'll start with the 40 years of experience. Very experienced panels here, who I'm sure you have seen a lot of his interviews, including some of the interesting conversation we have had on, what should the government do? What should the Philippines expect from the government? What are the changes and reforms we need? So, because I want to cover some very important things, including intellectual economic history, Banco Central, and monetary and fiscal policy, maybe, Stevie, I'll start with the easiest part with you, which is, does it even make sense for us to talk about industrial policy, a kind of a more proactive developmental state in the case of the Philippines, as a kind of corollary to your discussion of what's happening in the Philippine economy today? Is the part, someone is not happy, is the Philippine economy as it stands today sustainable? Is it delivering what it should deliver? And what kind of changes we should have on the horizon?
Well, it's sustainable if you're happy being a cripple. I mean, cripples are still alive, but they're never going to be athletes, right? So let me be very blunt. You're saying, should we concentrate on industrial policy? Well, not concentrating or having it for 40 years, whereas it brought us. When I was a kid, we were so colonial mentality that any good we wanted imported rather than local. Well, we got our wish because now we have no local goods. We're just a warehouse and logistics center besides a labor exporter. So we need industrial policy. And for the problem with industrial policy is it's very hard to get right, but it's worse when you don't have it. It's worse when you don't have it. It reminds you of the situation. Did we basically not do industrial policy well from independence up to our financial crisis in the 80s? Yes, we did a terrible job. So what's the solution? Don't do it or do it better. What was our answer? Wag na. All right. Now, in the 80s, we had no choice because we had no money. But it's been over 40. This year will be 40 years since EDSA. So what? We still have the same mindset? By that theory, we should all be watching films on Betamax. Okay? If everything else has developed, why hasn't our economic thinking and our development developed? When I remember in the 80s, that was the beginning of the Washington Consensus. Now Washington has ended it. Jake Sullivan said the Washington Consensus. Jake Sullivan, by the way, was the National Security Advisor under Biden, and you can look it up in the White House website. He said the Washington Consensus is a promise that was not kept. I would go further. It was a promise that was not kept by them. What did we face in 1983 to 86, and then the rest of Asia in 1997? When we had our difficulties, what did the IMF, the World Bank, and everybody say? Nothing's too big to fail. Open up your economy, privatize everything. And like teacher's pet, we said, yes, teacher, we'll do it, and we'll do it better than everybody else, which we did. Rather than act like some of our neighbors who said, I need the money, but what makes sense for me? I'll give you one concrete example. We sold all our cement companies, as did Indonesia. The only cement company we didn't sell was Northern Cement because it was sequestered, so it couldn't be sold. Everything else we sold. Holcim came, Lafarge came, Cemex came, everybody came. Okay? Now, what did Thailand and Indonesia and Malaysia think? We need the money, we need this. Let's sell, but let's keep the biggest guy local to keep a check on the foreigners rather than just trust markets and trust them. Cement prices in Thailand and Malaysia are lower than Indonesia and the Philippines because there's someone not just allowing free market forces to take reign and a real competitor. Now, but here's the best part. Why do I say it's a promise they didn't keep? What did they do in 2008 when they had their crisis, the West? Did they follow the advice they gave us? Did they open up their banks? Did they let these tiny companies like General Motors and AIG, Citibank, Bank of America fail and let the Japanese and Chinese buy them? No. They spent close to 2 trillion temporarily owning majority stakes in these major companies, having $1 trillion plus a year of TARP, which was basically printing credit. So they did the opposite of what they told us to do without even apologizing. So my advice is use critical thinking. Instead of following what we're told, follow what makes sense and what works for us. Now, to capture the second part of your theory about corruption. I have said previously, corruption is terrible and corruption is debilitating. But just like absence of malice does not equal virtue. Absence of corruption does not mean good policy or success. It just means absence of corruption. And shows you that this is something that we basically need to be subtle about. I looked up, in New York, I live near the 2nd Avenue subway. Let me read this is from AI Overview. The 2nd Avenue subway cost about per mile $2.5 to $4.6 billion to expand. Okay? That's the US, New York City. Now, you can say, what did Paris Metro cost? And no one will think Paris is a unprotected society with labor protection, everything, 40-hour work week, so on and so forth. 250. So 2.5 billion. Paris was kind of expensive, $250 million per month. So 10 to 12 times. that high price in Paris is what it costs in New York to do the New York side. We're talking about works, okay? We're not talking about buying the property or anything. So it just shows you corruption is debilitating. Absence of corruption is not enough. You have to have intelligent policies. And industrial policy is hard. Industrial policy, you can easily get it wrong rather than right. But it doesn't mean you just do nothing and become a nation of warehouses and exporting labor. So my view is, what does it bring? I hope we're going to start doing something about agricultural productivity, agricultural processing, and then, to be blunt, some beginnings of industrial policy. Because I used to think it was Bertrand Russell, but it's not. I thought he said, "I've never seen a nation starved into democracy." So lacking prosperity, lacking jobs, lacking opportunities for our people is not just bad economics. Good luck keeping a democracy going.
Thank you very much, Steve. I mean, I think we had a lot of quotable quotes already, but we'll go more into the details about industrial policy and how we should move forward. We have a lot of expertise in the room. I can see a couple of ex-secretaries, people involved in the industry. So we don't want to be too pretentious or presumptuous, and I'm looking forward to their reactions, if not violent criticisms, just in case. But to further contextualize, that's why we have a historian in the room. Well, of course, just released this book the other month, The Profligate Colonial, which perfectly provides the kind of intellectual history. What was the software behind this hardware situation that Stevie was talking about? So can you get the ball rolling on that?
Yeah, so
You want to use this one?
if you ask me why our central bankers, our policymakers are so austere, I actually can't answer the question because I devoted 70,000 words to the question. So I've answered it, but I still have a difficulty condensing it. So the first thing I think to say is the book is out on Kindle. It's purchased and try to answer the question more systematically there. It said, I want to dodge the question a little bit and talk about why this present interregnum is so interesting and why it's different from other periods in history. So if you look at mainstream economists, especially economists coming from the University of the Philippines, which supplies our policy makers and supplies the economists who take jobs in places like DOF, NEDA, and the central bank, a lot of them these days actually don't talk like economists, they talk like political scientists. So if you ask I was listening to a former central banker getting interviewed the other day, and he was being asked what are the problems of the Philippine economy. He was talking about a lack of good governance. He was talking about corruption. He was talking about the problems of education, which made me wonder, is this guy actually trained in economics or political scientist? Especially now, of course, because the good governance issue is front and center of our discussions by virtue of the flood control scandal. So there is a sense here that economists have historically abdicated their role to explain economics to the people and instead have just reduced it to politics. There are, I think, two reasons for this. Number one, the obfuscation helps them because it allows the economists to maintain the kind of control over the economic narrative, right? This is for experts, this is not for you. It's actually a very undemocratic move. The second thing is, I honestly think that for many of these people, they think the economics have been solved. So they were given the Washington consensus narrative that Stevie talks about. They implemented in the central bank, they implemented in the Department of Budget, they implemented in DOF. And when their policies fall apart, because they don't work, because we're still poor, and you ask them, you're doing the right things, right? Why are we still poor? Their answer is, it's politics, maybe. Like, it's corruption, right? It's bad governance. So this is actually a way in which they're able to wash their hands of the problems of society. So if there are political scientists in this room, do not allow yourselves to be used by the economists, right? Do not allow your work to be used as an excuse for bad economic policy. They think that the problem is solved and all they need to do is really tinker in the margins. This is a problem that's especially pronounced in the realm of budgeting and central banking. Now, the central bank, ostensibly according to Philippine law, is like the Supreme Court. It's supposed to be above politics, right? It's supposed to be the realm of expert. But when have we ever treated the Supreme Court as beyond politics? When Marvick Leonen came up with that stupid decision saying that essentially you could not impeach Sara Duterte, did you say, oh, Marvick is the expert, I'm going to shut up about it, right? Because he's a lawyer, I'm not. But when but when the central bank, which operates legally like the Supreme Court, when it raises rates, when it's very austere, you say, oh, they're the expert, right? I have nothing to say about that. So why is it that the Supreme Court is subject to democracy and are complaining, but the DOF, the DBM, and especially the Supreme Court is not? There is this sense then that economics has been settled. They've gotten away with this for at least 40 years. And the interesting thing is that I think they're not going to be able to get away with it anymore. And this is because previously the people who complained about these institutions were groups that were easily dismissed. Maybe they were associated with the radical left. Maybe they were communists. Maybe they were members of a group called the Freedom from Debt Coalition, which is sometimes difficult to take seriously. Or maybe because they weren't economists themselves. But I think it's very difficult to dismiss someone with 40 years of banking experience saying that economics is all wrong. And now what's interesting is that we have a new pole, a new center for alternative economic education in the Philippines. So I wonder what's going to happen when the people who are being employed by the government are actually students of Jesus and not students of the UB School of Economics. This is actually a very interesting intervention. And I want to be a cheerleader here and say something new is happening. These two gentlemen have shown us the way. Let's join them.
Thank you. Thank you, Laloy, for usurping the cheerleading. Okay, Jesus, before we go to, of course, I have to say that, a lot of us got to know Jesus from our earlier years, my more humble years as a junior staff in the legislature. I had a chance to meet you when you were working in the ADB. You spent almost 3 decades in this country. You know this country very well. It's not just your studies, it's not just scholarship, it's also passion and effort you're putting into countries, because people are wondering, like, who's this guy, named Jesus, and he has everything to say about our country. What authority you have to tell us what to do here? And I said, well, like 3 decades he has been here and studying this country very carefully. But as Lele correctly pointed out, if once upon a time you had an Oxford and you needed a Cambridge to balance it, hopefully we'll also have this kind of dynamics here and create new poles of thinking. And so I particularly asked you to come up with a PowerPoint. I'm sorry, that was very last minute. I just thought it would be nice if people can visualize how you're approaching this. There were a lot of, I would say, bad faith criticism that are not worth even engaging, or I would say motivated reasoning that was more like motivated on reasoning. But there were also some, I would say, good faith critics, including from good friends of us, like Professor from Alfred Paloyo from Wollongong University, who said, is this a kind of a subtle version of modern monetary theory? It brought back debates about Japan's monetary policy and Japan's interest in economics over the past half a century. And then, of course, there are also some people are saying, just like Lalo, that, let's listen to him. Maybe he has something interesting to say. And at the end of the day, we're here to push for not this petty inter-school, like debates. We're here for responsible, productive macroeconomic thinking. So, Jesus, can you give us a kind of an executive summary version of this advocacy that you have been engaged in? And maybe for people who are not had the chance to read it, if you could also remind them of the new papers you have released and also an idea about your upcoming book. Thank you, Jesus.
Thank you so much. I tend to speak very loud. It's by now professional information. I feel very. Is it okay?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, very uncomfortable with the mic in my hands, but I'll do it. Richard, thank you so much. Delighted to be here with great co-panelists, Stephen and Deloitte. Actually, a way of background. When Richard and I met a few minutes ago, before the show began, we reminded each other we met long time ago. And it's not that I've been here, Richard, for almost 30 years. It's that this is my 30th year.
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
I came to the Philippines in 1996. So I have seen a lot, not as much as most of you, but sufficient to get an idea of what has happened to the country. And what has happened is, just if you want, close your eyes. Close your eyes. Whatever the Philippines has done, not just during the last 40 years, as Steve was saying, since the 1980s until today, but it's in the last 2 million years. Whatever the country has done amounts to $4,700 per capita. That's it. And this is one of the numbers that we show our students in our development class. And We show them, we put it together with the distribution of income per capita all around the world, and the students get the story very clearly. We are much closer to Haiti or Afghanistan than to Switzerland and Norway, period. So whatever the country has done, and this doesn't mean that any of us here, our per capita income is $4,000. It's much higher. But imagine if the average is $4,000, how many million for Filipinos are way, way, way below. So the story is something wrong. There's something wrong. We're in the year 2526, $4,700 per capita income, lower middle income per capita, bordering upper middle income, irrelevant. That's not the point. So after a lot of thinking, discussions with some of my colleagues, and obviously having studied at depth what happened in the Philippines, a lot of comparison with other countries, how other countries did it. Because remember, the Philippines in the 1960s was richer than South Korea in terms of per capita income, than China, than Thailand, than Indonesia, and communist Vietnam. Very inefficient economy, planning economy, what it just overtook us. Something is wrong. And what I have concluded is that this country has ended up in a self-inflicted pain mode. Self-inflicted pain mode. It's an exercise in masochism, what happens in the Philippines. Plain masochism. It is what happened between 1946 independence and let's say the 1980s, not terribly different from what was happening in many other countries. Trying things. The Philippines was trying to industrialize at some point, right or wrong. Not everything that South Korea did in the 60s was really fantastic, was a bed of roses, but they just hit it. The Philippines was trying to do very much the same thing as South Korea. In fact, President Marcos' father was trying to copy the industrial policies of President Park. It's just that he ended up in a disaster. But that is the first part. The second part is what happens in the 1980s. In the 1980s is the anti-development model. It was the obsession with reforming things that are absolutely irrelevant. Still today, capital markets reform. I'm not against it, but if we think that that is going to give us what? $40,000 per capita income because I pay a lower tax rate when I sell my stocks? Really? This is what we do? This is what this government is doing. Still today. What happened during the previous 40 years? Reforming everything, but forgetting what Steve was getting at, which is what development has traditionally been, which is transforming your economy. Sending workers out of agriculture into what? Manufacturing, of course. Here we send them into motorcycle services. That's what we do. So still today, the largest employer in the country is agriculture together with, already very close, wholesale and retail trade. The third one is construction. So if you put together agriculture, wholesale and retail trade in construction, that represents 50% of our employment in three sectors of extremely low productivity. Hello, you want to find out why our income per capita is very low? Because of corruption? Of course not. 25 million, almost 25 million of all workers in the Philippines are working in sectors of extremely low productivity, which means extremely low wages, which means extremely low income per capita. It's self-inflicted pain. Not understanding this, okay? So I'm sure I will get back to this because it's absolutely fundamental. Absolutely fundamental. And this is not even, Richard, thinking in terms of the next government, it's tomorrow.
Yeah.
It's yesterday.
Right.
This cannot be postponed. All right? This is one thing. The other one I also appreciate at Steve's point is the obsession with, and that's what I'm going to talk about if Richard allows me in a few minutes, and we don't have the money. Does anybody here understand what money is? We don't have money. I'm going to leave it here because that's the part of the presentation. So what I'm going to do is walk you through the two papers that I have in a few minutes that I have written that have led to a lot of misunderstandings to people. Some people say that we, my co-authors and I, minimize corruption. Of course we don't minimize corruption, for God's sake. We're simply saying this is not the capital sin of the Philippines. It's not the capital sin. The capital sin is not having industry. That's our capital sin. So you think that corruption in the Philippines is less than or smaller than in countries that have 3 times our per capita income? Of course not. And we show that in the first paper. This is not to say that we condone corruption. Of course not. The thieves should be in prison. But let's differentiate the story. This is not why we have $4,700 per capita income. So what I want to do is link this to the fundamental question that is the complement of our lack of industrialization, the other part of the self-inflicted pain. We don't have money. So I'm going to tell you quickly, we don't have money to build the schools. We don't have money to build hospitals, public hospitals. We don't have money to address malnutrition. It's the biggest fallacy. And this is government after government telling us that we don't have money. So if Richard allows me in a few minutes, I'll walk you through the story. And I really hope that this help us, or helps you open your eyes about and really understand how politics is done in this country and really managing the country. And it's really self-inflicted pain. I really hope that later on with the conversation we get into something useful. Thank you.
Are you going to do the
Can
presentation?
you go now?
Yeah, let's do it.
Let me
Yeah.
go. Then let me go. All right. Thank you so
We've
much.
done great intro.
Let me stand up. And also I face you all.
See,
I hope it doesn't take me a long time. As I said, I tend to speak very, very loud. By the way, let me introduce my colleague, Rika Soler Leloy. She's the chair of the department. She's the person you need to talk to to change our program. We're thinking about it. Rika, I think you got the message. All right. So let me. This is. I'm going to start with the story of when the thieves really stole our taxes. That many people really got annoyed when I tell you the thieves have not stolen your taxes because it is technically impossible to steal taxes. And that requires a little understanding of public finance. Okay? That is part of the story. The other part is the implications that this has for monetary and fiscal policy that Richard was announcing. Okay? The 2 papers that we have written can be downloaded from my webpage. Okay? And this is a paper co-written with my colleagues, Scott Weiler, Gerardo Largoza Bombit, and Rika Soler, she's here. Okay? So just for the record, I insist, because if I've been really annoying here that we don't care about corruption, of course yes. Corruption is the misappropriation of public funds. We are against it, and it needs to be addressed. And I am convinced that will be addressed the same way that it has been historically addressed by all countries that today have $50,000, $60,000 per capita income. As I asked, you really believe that when Switzerland had $4,000, $700 like today, it was not a corrupt economy? You have no idea. You have no idea what you're saying. Of course, yes. Of course, yes. It's about dealing with it. And we are still, at that level. But the good thing about it is that what happened, it will awaken everybody's eyes. And we will follow what happened in other countries. The mechanisms will be implemented. It might take some time, but I'm convinced, I'm really, really optimistic that it will be done. The first of corruption, well, it's obvious. Infrastructure that was supposed to be there is not. We don't have the flood control project. That is okay. This is very serious, and it has a negative impact. But I want to ask you all on what exactly? What exactly? Why this question? Well, I insist, because there are countries with about the same or higher corruption indices that we have, but a much higher per capita income. So I'm absolutely convinced that the lack or the fact that this infrastructure was not built has an impact. But if you ask me, what is exactly the channel and what is the ultimate variable being affected? I tell you, I do not know. I do not know. It cannot be growth, because these other countries have much higher per capita income. That means that they were growing despite having corruption. I agree that there is something, but we do not know. And that is what we argue in this paper. It's not that we say that the corruption doesn't matter. It's that we say, let's have a serious conversation about it. Okay? And as I was saying, corruption is not the Philippines' capital sin. This is not the main reason why we have $4,470 per capita income. Corruption makes things worse, but it's not the original sin. Okay? So what is the standard argument? What is happening? And this is a sentence that we got from our students in La Salle when they began demonstrating and I saw a big sign saying the thieves stole our taxes. Immediately I called Rika and I said, that's it. They don't know it. We need to do something at least with our students. This was like October or something like that when they walk out. So the problem with this argument is that it's technically wrong. Simply not true. Because taxes, I'm going to show you, cannot be stolen. Okay? So to understand why this is the case, one must understand how governments make payments and how they tax. And what I'm going to show you now is not a theory. I'm not inventing anything. It's the Philippine law, which is identical to the laws in every normal economy in the world today. What BSP does today is the same as BOJ does in Japan or the Fed, with very small technical differences that are irrelevant for the argument, for the discussion today. 99% of what I'm going to tell you is in Republic Act 7653, which is the creation of the central bank. Can I ask you, how many of you have read Republic Act 7653? But all of you believe that for the government to spend, it needs to tax. And what I'm going to show you is that is not written here at all. In fact, it tells you openly that is not what we do. If you read it, it tells you that is not what we do. Okay? All right. In a nutshell, the Philippine government, like any modern government, does not use taxes to make payments. Taxes are not used to build infrastructure. That is a fallacy. Not true. Okay? The Philippine government draws from its account at BSP every time it makes a payment. Every time there is a payment, the government calls its banker, called BSP, and the bank and the central bank authorizes that and creates what is called in the banking terminology reserves. Reserves is I'm going to show you later, is the technical name for the money used in the banking system. Okay? These funds are created. This is something that the lawyer already loves. Ex nihilo. This is a Latin class now. At will. The central bank creates money without money. Let me give you the analogy that we use with our students. You all must have been probably at Araneta Coliseo watching basketball games. You have seen the electronic board. Where does the person clicking the points get the points? Do you think he has a baul? And he gets the points from the baul? Just clicks. Exactly the same way that BSP creates money. The same way. Ex nihilo, out of nothing. That's where the money comes from. Remember the money we use today, since 1971, the full end of the gold standard is called fiat money. Fiat money. The bills that we use is called fiat money. It is created ex nihilo. So the second part is taxes or funds returned to BSP. And I'm going to show you the accounting. Taxes are not parked in any account to be used or reused. Not true. Okay? And they disappear from the system. So every time the government spends, is creating money together with BSP. Every time you pay taxes, those things, the money disappears from the system. The money is, we're simplified, we claim is destroyed. You will not read destroyed in here, but that's exactly what it amounts to. That is in a nutshell the story. And I repeat, what I'm going to tell you now is not just whether we are going to do it in the Philippines. It happens every single day in the Philippines. So, Republic Act 7653 is very clear about all this. It is very clear when you read it. I'm going to show you a couple of sections that spending and taxation are completely separate and linked operational processes. Spending goes this way, taxation goes a completely different way. There is nothing in the middle that says your taxes are kept in an account, whoever, I don't know, Treasury or BSP, and reused. Simply not true. Okay? And I insist, it's not theory, it is the law. And it's operational reality. I put here controversial or difficult to grasp because these are some of the comments that have appeared. So everybody feels comfortable with the story of I pay taxes, my taxes are parked somewhere, doesn't matter where, and then they are reused. That's okay. When I'm going to tell you controversial, there's nothing controversial. Nothing controversial. Okay? So, this is not to say that the government does not need a proper accounting. The mere fact that the government, together with its banker, BSP, create money at will, doesn't mean that we don't need some sort of accounting. Far from that. Of course, this is needed. Okay? That's just in case somebody says, hey, come on, this is a joke. No, we're not claiming that. All right? So let me tell you a couple of sections from 7653. Republic Act 7653 treats spending as a legal instruction to BSP by Congress and Treasury. That is what the law says. And Treasury treats taxes as Treasury receipts, not as funding instruments. Very different. It's just a receipt, not funding instrument. That's what the law says. So, what are the key sections in the law? There are many others. You have to read this very clearly. All national government receipts are credited to Treasury accounts at BSP. When you pay your taxes, by law, they end up in the Treasury account at BSP. They're not parked anywhere. All government payments are made through BSP. Government does not make any payment. In other words, part of what I am telling you is that the key actor to understand fiscal policy in the Philippines happens to be the central bank. Not even Treasury. It's BSP. Because everything, every payment, and every receipt ends up in BSP's balance sheet, as I'm going to show you. It has to be because BSP is the banker of Treasury. So all movements, receipts, and payments happen to be, as I'm going to show you, in the balance sheet of BSP. Every peso of reserve, which I said is the money here, reserve balances are peso denominated demand deposits, used to settle government spending, is created by BSP. Every time I insist, the government is paying a civil servant, is creating money. Every time the government says, I'm gonna pay Mr. X to build a road, is creating money. That's what it says. Spending is operationally a reserve credit decision by BSP, simply subject to authorization and not to funding availability. That is not true. That is not true. It's simply authorization. Nothing to do with, do we have money? Of course not. And reserve availability is a policy variable. Do we want it or not? Do we want to do it or not? It's not a treasury constraint at all. Okay? All this is from the law, Philippine law. So I'm going to show you now the T accounts, and this is called reserve accounting. For those of you unfamiliar, Rick and I invite you to our macro class next Tuesday, okay? To come to class. And this is the reality of what happens. So what happens in reality is much more complex than simply you pay taxes. Taxes are parked somewhere and the taxes are used. So the key actor, to really understand this, is the central bank. So that's why this separation of fiscal and monetary policy is an illusion. Simply not true in reality. So every time there is a payment, government creates deficit, you will see what it creates. The central bank creates reserves, okay? This is debited from the government account at BSP, and this money exists at X in ILO. This is immediately transferred to your account in BDO. Suppose that this is you, the person who receives the payment. This is your bank account, and this is you. And this is happening every single time the government makes a payment. It's creating reserves. This is debited from the reserves of the government account at BSP. Of course, the net worth of the government goes down, and the net worth of the recipient goes up every single time. So, for those of you who think that running a deficit is a drama for the country, every time the government makes a payment and runs a deficit, is directly creating a private sector surplus. Whoever thinks that running a deficit is a problem, I want to elaborate on this, is that you don't really understand it. A government deficit, if I am the government and I run a deficit, it means that I gave you in government spending 1,000 pesos and you gave me in taxes 500. If I run a surplus, is that you gave me 1,000 and I gave you 500. Raise your hands, those of you who feel comfortable with that situation. Because immediately, I'm going to show you later, budget surplus is deflationary because the first thing that it does is to affect your pocket. This is a windfall for the private sector. So hearing people in the private sector complaining about the government running a deficit is mind-boggling. Honestly, is peso for peso. When the government makes a payment, is an increase of the surplus for the private sector. Peso for peso, dollar for dollar, yen for yen. And this is because there is a fundamental difference between your finances and my finances and those of the government. You really have a budget constraint. I have a budget constraint. I don't have the capacity to create money. Treasury and BSP do it every single second of the day. They're doing it. Okay? So, a government deficit, which is government spending more than taxing, increases banks' reserves held in accounts at the central bank. That is the main thing. All this action, I insist, happens because of central bank is using fiat, because today we use fiat money and it's created at will. Okay? What happens when we pay taxes? It's exactly the opposite. Is now your account, you are debited here in your account. Then these are reserves, which is what the commercial bank received. This goes back to the central bank with a negative sign, and the government's account is the one credited. It's exactly the opposite, in the opposite direction. This is written here. In case I know that I'm going to be fast, but I just want to give you the gist. The gist that when you pay taxes, the taxes are not parked anywhere. They go back to BSP, and I'm not inventing this. This is exactly a transcription of what Republic Act 7653 says. It happens. Okay? So putting everything together, Filipino terms, when Congress of the Philippines authorizes spending, Treasury instructs BSP to pay. It's not that Treasury gets money from anywhere. Treasury is instructing BSP. BSP credits bank reserve accounts. So what BSP does is, I'm Mr. So-and-so, and I'm going to build a road. BSP transfer me the money to my bank in BDO, and then that's a deposit to me. At no point, BSP checks if there are tax balances. BSP certainly does not transfer the receipts to banks, and BSP does not use taxes at all. It's creating new money. Okay? And taxes reduce bank reserves, increase treasury deposits, and very important, an accounting offsets. No payments. So in any normal economy today, you are constantly have BSP creating new money. Every time a civil servant is being paid, same story, no taxes, same story. And every time we pay taxes, those funds completely disappear from the system. This happens like in every single economy. Okay? So what is the problem that we have? Well, that our textbooks say, going back to the way we have been educated, and people believe that Treasury pays from a commercial bank account. Nothing to do with that. Or that taxes replenish that account. Nothing to do with that. Or that spending is constrained by balances. Nothing to do with that. All this comes from something that we think that the government finances are like ours. It's what we call the family analogy. I have a budget constraint. In the long run, I cannot spend much more than my income. Sooner or later, something happens. The government is a different animal. Very different animal. Okay? We can talk later about whether this has a limit that Richard was asking me or not. But let's separate the story. Let's separate the story, because the argument begins going back, Steve, we don't have money. Of course we have money. We have as much money as the electronic board in Araneta Coliseum. Infinite. Okay? So let me get back to the story of the thieves, because now the question is, so what have they stolen? And this is in the paper, so I'm not going to walk you back to give you the gist. The thieves stole commercial bank deposits. In the end, somebody's account was credited, and they took the money. They took the money. But that money is not taxes. It's the money that BSP created. So they are a bunch of thieves, because these people do not have to do what you and I have to do to buy a Louis Vuitton bag, which is work. Somebody, it's a lottery ticket. That's it. But let's differentiate, and that is punishable. It must be punished. But that's very different from the argument, and they took people's money. Not true. Not true. So this is the accounting of what happened. Suppose that what they have done is to buy an apartment. in the Philippines. We have several examples in our paper. Okay? And again, basically what happens is, this person got deposits here. This is a real estate company. This is the thief bank, and the key actor again is BSP. BSP is the key actor here. All right. Again, this is written in the paper in a paragraph. Absolutely convinced that everybody will really understand it, because this is just simple accounting, not the accounting of a company, but it's the accounting of central bank and government spending. All right. So if no taxes, what did they steal? The thieves stole bank deposits, no taxes, and they go for free in apartment. That is punishable. But if you think that they got your money, the answer is no. I see some faces of disappointment. So the obvious question is, can the government, quote unquote, redo the project? The answer is, of course, yes. This doesn't mean, or this doesn't say that we can have this running around. We don't want that. But technically speaking, nothing prevents the Filipino government from saying tomorrow another 500 million pesos for this project. Nothing prevents that. Okay? So these people must be punished because infrastructure is not there. But please let's stop saying that these people stole our money or people's money, because that is technically incorrect. And certainly, government, PSP, and taxpayers are not poorer because of the corruption standard. Not true. We are not poorer. And certainly BSP can never be poorer. It's the money machine. BSP is not poorer. Okay? Let me go and finalize here with what does all this mean? Because there is a bigger picture. And the bigger picture is what we were discussing in our introductory remarks. What does this mean for us as a nation? And I'm going to talk for a few minutes about nation building. Okay? So beyond the fact that what has been stolen is not taxes, what I'm going to try to do in a few minutes is demystify government finances beyond what I have already done. And this matters for a proper understanding of economic policy and why we are what we are. 4,000, whatever, $700 per capita income for 4,000. Why we're here. Okay? And what happens, linked to what I was saying, is that for decades we have been subjected to what I call here innocent frauds about accounting and what the government does. And this has really killed our economy. Because if you allow me, Lloyd, we're also publishing a book. Yeah, I do. I want to talk about it in a second. In our book, what we do is to make forecasts about where the country is going to go in the next 25 years. And we argue that either there are changes along the lines of what we have described, or what we will observe in the nation is we created the acronym MOTS, M-O-T-S, more of the same. More of the same. We'll be wondering why in 2020, in 2050, Cambodia will have overtaken us. More of the same. Reforms that are absolutely useless. Creating employment in manufacturing, no, that's not what we do. But that is what all the countries that have overtaken us did during the last 50 years. But here we don't do it. Okay? So, because of the innocent frauds that have really killed this nation. Our government definitely is not financially constrained. Steve, do we have the money? Absolutely, yes. We have the money. We may face real constraints. In other words, there might not be a company that can build a school. That's a different story. We have no bricks. We don't have cement. That's a real constraint. But that's not pesos. So I'm talking about in our own currency. You're talking about getting dollars is a different thing. Okay? So here we are often told that we don't have resources. One of the first things that Rick and I teach our students in the program, resources. What characterizes the word resources is scarcity. Oil is scarce. It's a resource. Pesos in the Philippines cannot be a resource because there is no limit. So please, let's stop referring to pesos as a resource. And when you hear from now on the government saying we don't have resources, please laugh. Listen, this is not true. We have it. Okay? When you hear that this is a standard situation in the country, that government spending is greater than taxes, you hear Secretary of Finance after Secretary of Finance saying something like, and I promise that I will get the difference. Of course you're going to get the difference. I'm going to tell you how. Always. But not because you're a magician. It's simply because of how the system works. In the Philippines, in Japan, in the US, everywhere. Of course you get the difference. without really begging the private sector, which is the biggest fallacy also in the country. Do we believe that we depend on the private sector to finance the difference? Absolutely not true. Okay? So the fiscal deficits I already showed you briefly, but I hope you believe me, is a windfall for the private sector. It's an increase in net worth. And the example that I gave you, however silly and simplistic, is true. I give you 1,000 pesos in government spending, you give me 500 in taxes. The difference, 500, is my deficit, which is called your surplus. If you understand the accounting, we are obsessed with the government deficit. It's simply that in the national accounts it will appear as a surplus of the private sector. In our accounts, flow funds produced by the central bank appears. It appears. It's simply the obsession with the deficit. Okay. I'll talk also in a second about what is the effect of this policy that I'm talking about on interest rates and on inflation. Okay, because people might think, oh, this is running, etc., etc. Okay, not to mention that in an economy like ours, we cannot live like without a budget deficit because we run a current account deficit. So the only way in an economy like that of the Philippines for the private sector not to have a deficit is if the government runs a deficit. Those of you interested in this, attend our class on Tuesday. I'll repeat it. And this happens, there are very few economies in the world that can survive with a fiscal surplus. Very few. And there are technical reasons why they have to do it. The rest of us, nothing. And especially like the Philippines, you have a current account deficit, you need a fiscal deficit in order not to submerge the private sector into deficit, which is what happens in the crisis that Steve was referring to. What do you think happened in 97, 98, or in the great financial crisis of 2008, 2009? You think that was because of budget deficits? No, it was the private sector. The private sector. Immediately, the problem was solved. How? The government ran a deficit. The deficit turned the private sector into surplus. And that's what happened during COVID. The massive government spending is reflected into a super huge surplus of the private sector. The national accounts show this. Okay? Fiscal surplus for an economy like the Philippines will be a total death sentence. Total death sentence. It will be deflationary, unless, of course, we manage to have a large current account surplus. And then we become Germany decades ago or Singapore. Because then, if you have a large current account surplus, you do not need another injection into the economy, which will be the deficit. We will put the economy on steroids. So these economies that have a large current account surplus need to have a fiscal surplus, which is a leakage out of the economy. For that reason, not because they're very good. It's because otherwise the economy will be in steroids, inflation, etc. So don't associate the surplus to a better managed economy. Nothing to do with the finances of a family or a firm. Nothing to do with that. Okay? National debt associated to this is a shame. Our national debt is 17 trillion. It just happened that, again, if you understood the accounting, and I just told you that the fiscal deficit is peso for peso, the surplus of the private sector, peso for peso. What is the other side of national debt? How do we call it? Does any of you here own a T-bill? Nobody owns a T-bill. Nobody. I'm the only one here. I'm the only foreigner. It's the private sector wealth, peso for peso. So when the T-bills that Treasury auctions is what we call debt. Debt is from the point of view of the national government. If you ask me what is my wealth position, I will tell you I own an apartment, I own a yacht, I own whatever, and 3 million pesos in T-bills. Peso for peso is the wealth of the private sector. These are the T-bills. So who owns this? Most of this in the Philippines, of course, the banking sector. The banking sector. Okay? So the question is, why do we have this? Okay? And in reality, what happens is that the T-bills are pieces of paper. I assume that you have at least seen them. Pieces of paper that the government offers you, all of us in the private sector. Okay? In exchange for what? for the excess reserves in the banking system. That is caused by the deficit. Remember, the budget deficit implies excess reserves in the banking system. Okay? Who buys the debt? Not you or me. It's the primary dealers. The primary dealers are the major banks. Most of the debt is in the hands of the primary dealers, banks in the Philippines. You and I can buy debt in the secondary market from them, not a problem. Okay? So you imagine what happens is the following. Bobby, can I use you? Thank you so much. This is my friend Bobby. Bobby, I am the government. I give you in government spending 1,000. You give me in taxes 500. I run a deficit. Okay? Now what I do is now if I run a deficit, you run a surplus. You have excess liquidity in your pocket. Now I come to you and I offer you a piece of paper, and I say, give me your 500 pesos for 3 years. And after 3 years, I'm gonna give you back your 500 pesos plus 10% interest. Will you take it or not? That's what happens. That is the famous debt. That is the famous debt of the country. And it amounts to 17 trillion pesos. So what? So what? Why is this a problem? It is, after all, a monetary operation. The government is not borrowing at all. It's offering all of us a piece of paper for our excess liquidity. The question is, why is this necessary? And it's necessary, I insist, not to finance the government. The spending has already happened. I run a budget deficit. It is because the deficit is pushing the BSP's policy rate down. When you have excess liquidity, is anybody here from the banking system? What happens when you have excess liquidity in the banking system? What happens to interest rates? They go up or down? Excess liquidity in the market, they go down, of course. They go down. But you have a key institution in the country that says that cannot happen. That institution is BSP, because BSP operates a corridor system in the Philippines with an inflation target. So when Governor Remolona says the overnight interest rate in this country is 4.5%, he has to defend it. Because in the face of excess liquidity, interest rate goes down. So immediately BSP and Treasury coordinate, and they need to take out that liquidity. That's why they offer you this, Bobby. Not because it needs to borrow. And they're doing that constantly. So, two things. First of all, the budget deficit, it leads to downward pressure on interest rates in the country, not upward pressure. And second, on the one hand, it's true that I'm spending more, and that is when Richard might say, Jesus, is that going to cause inflation? But I just told you that at the same time, it's withdrawing demand from the system. That's why you don't have the inflation that we have in the Philippines has nothing to do with this. Most of it is what? Supply driven. Supply shocks. It's not this, not that. When the commercial banks go to BSP and ask for money, what do they need to give in collateral? T-bills. T-bills. That's why it stabilizes the financial system. Not only that, you as the primary dealers to give up debt, they will hang you, because the debt is guaranteed to be paid back by BSP. They know it. That stabilizes their portfolio, and that allows them to do other operations, riskier operations. For that reason. So this is the so-called debt is the best thing that happened in history to all of us. Okay? So please stop also saying that Filipinos owe 130,000 pesos on average. It's the silliest thing. Has any of you, by the way, gotten a letter at home saying give me 130,000 pesos? It will not happen. Actually, if anything, it's the opposite. On average, each Filipino owns 130,000 pesos in wealth, T-bills. Most of it concentrated in a few people, sure. But if you want to take an average, that is what happens. Debt in Japan, in the US, well over 100%, 200% of GDP. So what? People ask me sometimes, yeah, but the government has to pay interest. How does the government pay interest? The same way I told you before. Calling BSP, crediting your account, etc., etc. Not to mention that when the government pay interest, is increasing your pockets. That goes into your disposable income, and that appears in the national accounts of the Philippines. Part of the disposable income of the Philippines is your wages plus interest. This is the interest that we get. We don't want that. And we claim to be a consumption-driven economy. This is it. Okay? I'm finishing. Super important to rethink the budget. We need to stop saying, we need to start to collect, we collect taxes and then we ask, what can we afford? We need to do what do we want as a nation. And that is how our macroeconomic policy needs to change. From what can we afford? We can afford whatever we need. We need a school, of course we can afford it. That's what do we want to be as a nation? This doesn't mean, I'm not saying that the budget has to triple between today and next year. Nothing to do with that. But we still need some planning, priorities, etc. But please, let's get rid of the shackles that really are part of the problem that this country has had for decades. The government has a budget constraint like a family, not true. Sound finance, but what did I say that is not sound? It's already happening. I'm not claiming that the government needs to spend as if there is no tomorrow. I'm simply saying that if you ask me, can we build a school? The answer is of course yes. Can we get rid of malnutrition? Of course yes. Okay. Do we have fiscal space? I can elaborate later. So the conversation cannot really start with these claims that are absolutely incorrect. And I encourage you all to take a look at Republic Act 7653 because all I'm doing here is paraphrasing. Okay. Taxes, you may ask. So what do taxes do? Taxes do other things. We can discuss it later. Are necessary. But I insist not to finance the government. That is not true. They play a different role in the economy. All right? So I finish here. So can we financially afford the basic infrastructure that we need? Absolutely yes. Absolutely yes. When we pay in pesos, the thing is to say, now the government is going to indebt in something dollar. Oh, that's a different thing. Then you need to get dollars to repay. But pesos, absolutely not a problem. Okay? This is an example. I go back to this because I have read a lot in the recent months about the Department of Education is struggling to build 165,000 schools. What is the cost of building a school? Nothing. How do you build? How does the government pay for the school? The same way I said it. Call BSP and pay for it. These are paid in pesos. Okay? So public goods like this one must be valued in terms of the real resources that they use. So what is the real cost of a school? Is the extra consumption that possibly formerly unemployed workers could enjoy. So we need to produce more food. That is the cost. Because we have people in the construction sector who were unemployed. Employ them. That is the cost. But if you tell me the cost is in the budget, is 500,000 pesos, I will tell you that is not true. That is not true. That appears in the budget. How do we pay for it? BSP will pay for it. The way all payments are done. Okay? And of course, now the government is calling the private sector using PPPs to build schools. What is the rationale? The rationale is the government cannot afford it. Not true. The second one is the private sector knows better. Not true. Simple. This is not to say that in some areas we couldn't have PPPs to do some things, etc., etc. But if the rationale is I don't have money, incorrect. Absolutely incorrect. Okay? So, and I finish here. And I put this because many people ask me, so do BSP, Treasury, Finance, and they know this? You will be surprised. I have noticed that they operate in silos. So in other words, even though they claim to coordinate, after all, you claim to be in BSP and your work is the interest rate and the exchange rate. And you work in DBM and you're an accountant. Okay? Not to mention that, of course, there are vested interests. People having done the same thing for years and acknowledging that what they have done it doesn't work is very, very difficult. Okay? Last year, I think I was telling Richard when we met that I met all the technical staff of Congress and Senate in January 2025. 2 days working with this on this. They have what I call here a moralistic religious view. We need to get taxes. We need to make sure that the tycoons pay. That's the story. Without that, we don't move forward. They could not understand. I said, look, you may want Mr. X to pay taxes. One of the main reasons is, of course, inequality. But not because you believe that whatever Mr. X pays is going to help you build another school or infrastructure. So I go back, what we have in the country is absolute self-inflicted pain. Because what I'm describing here, I'm not inventing, it's already happening. It's just making sure that we use it for nation building. Okay? This is the book that we're publishing. The economy toward 2050, we have projections until 2050, and we argue that either these changes along these two axes that I have mentioned, the first one already mentioned by Steve, we need to industrialize. Of course, agriculture is a problem in the country, but we need a government that really says, I'm going to do what I'm supposed to do. Or all we see in the next 25 years is more of the same. Okay? So I say that what we link is this the story that I've been telling you about. We don't have money to changing the structure of the economy. Industrial policy is absolutely fundamental. And we need to become a more complex economy, not just the economy that Steve was describing. Was that Steve? Logistics and warehouses and a little bit more than that. That's what we do. Okay. So I think I'm gonna stop here, not without thanking you, and I hope that really that what I have told you really complements what Stephen Rowe said. Thank you so much.
That's what like a Tchaikovsky concerto. Obviously, we can have a long academic discussion, including about modern monetary theory. I also suggest for people to check also responses by other academics to your work. Obviously, the proviso there is we're not talking about foreign financing. We're not talking about the foreign capital.
That's the
But if for some of you, if you think this seems like magical thinking, which is in the title of some of the critiques of Jesus' work, just Google quantitative easing and the debates around quantitative easing. It makes you realize what fiat money means and the ongoing debates when it comes to monetary policies. The fundamental message, at least I think we all should get from Dr. Felipe here, is that there's much more room for maneuver than we realize. Like, unless the way of us thinking about the room for maneuver, we constricted ourselves, right? So that's a very important thing. So before I go to the responses and questions and all, maybe Stevie, you want to bring in the other perspective because you have been dealing not only with the private sector but a lot of emerging markets. And if you look at the more successful emerging markets, they somehow balance this kind of I would say proactive monetary fiscal policy, but at the same time they still had to deal with international financing, investment grade, those credit ratings. So how do you think the successful countries balance that out so that we can build on what Jesus is trying to do here?
Let me say something complementary, which is like the flip side, not the contradictory side, the flip side. What was the difference with what the US did in 2008 with quantitative easing versus us?
Stay with this one. Sorry about that.
Okay, versus us. I think it died again when it gets to me. But anyway, versus us in 1983 and 1987. What was the big difference? Even Japan now, we are told we're investment grade because we have 60% debt to GDP. Japan has over 200. Sorry, if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. Okay. Okay. Versus Japan.
Bring it up here.
Versus now. So whatever. Okay.
Steve, you want to go concerto maybe about
Alright.
yeah. Sorry about that. I don't know.
Okay.
Someone is not happy with that.
Okay. Versus Japan, which has over 200% debt to GDP. Versus the US, which has over 100% debt to GDP. Why are we third world governments told we have to be on the maybe better not. I'll try to have a loud voice also like Dr. Felipe. Okay. So why are we told stick to 60? And why can Japan go to 200? Why could US do quantitative easing and direct equity support and investments of close to 2 trillion after 2008? Why? They have reserve currencies, number one, we don't. Number two, very big difference. Japan funds its debt domestically in yen because it has a robust manufacturing and services sector, so it can source nearly everything domestically. Let's say we want to do this because of our dearth of manufacturing and our wealth of warehouses and logistics. What can we source domestically? What was the best proof in COVID? We were hoping to have a bottling plant to bring the vaccine from a big container to a small container. Not to even make the vaccine under license. No, just to shift sterile containers to smaller sterile containers to use. So what it for me is the corollary. What did other people do? They did not forget manufacturing. Because the more you can build in your country, the more you can borrow and expand in your own currency versus having to borrow to get it done internationally. It's working, not yet.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's
it is.
better. Yeah.
Internationally, that's number one. Number two, besides quality jobs and better pay than basically tilling the soil or speaking Mamser English, which is a grammatical monstrosity. I hate that actually, Mamser shit. Okay, no, but
Maybe it's
in addition, every manufacturing job on average creates 4 to 6 new jobs and helps the multiplier effect. So what is the point about running a deficit? It's to run a productive deficit, not I throw a party and then tomorrow the foie gras is gone. It is to build something, to create something that has a return on investment, that has a multiplier effect. That's what other countries do. Okay, I remember I was part of the team that did the privatization of PTT, Petroleum Authority of Thailand, in the 90s. And the guy said, "You're Filipino?" I said, "Yeah." "Is your father-in-law, do you know Antonio Del Rosario?" And I said, "He's my father-in-law." I said, "Oh, please give him my best regards because I actually trained under him because we modeled what he did on PNOC." Now, but however, what did they do? They thought more deeply. When we found natural gas in Manampaya, what did we do? We provided the fuel for power plants, which is good. What did Malaysia and Thailand do when they found gas in the Gulf of Thailand and the Gulf of Malaysia, which is basically they started to be nice about it and said, we're not going to argue who owns what because underneath the border, we don't know where the gas is coming from. So Thailand and Malaysia just said 50% for you, 50% for me. What did they do? Naturally. I'll tell you, only part of it was to fuel power plants. They created a petrochemical industry on the back of that, which helped create the car assembly industry, which helped fund the steel industry. One of my big clients, who I did an $800 million acquisition for in the US, I'll give you the name, Indorama. All right? I said, he's Indian, and they had petrochemical plants, plastic plants in India, and they moved to Thailand. I said, "Why did you go to Thailand?" He said, "Because we have cheap input material." I said, "Why don't you go to the Philippines?" "Because I don't have cheap input material." Because we didn't process the natural gas into base petrochemicals, which Thailand and Malaysia did, which then became complex petrochemicals, which became plastics, which became other things. So that is what a good deficit does. It is productive. It is quality. It is value added. It's multiplicative. Let's use another example, Indonesia. About 11 years ago, Widodo said, no more raw exports of nickel concentrate. Now, we're number 2, a distant number 2, kind of like maybe Lenny to Marcos in the last election, number 2. Okay? Not to be political about it. But what did they say? No more raw nickel exports. What did the West say? Oh, it's anti-trade, we'll file a complaint. They said, no, screw you. And so the last year of that raw nickel exports, the exports every year of nickel concentrate was $4.9 billion. Today, because they forced all the manufacturing to be done there, and nickel is very critical to electric vehicles and cell phones. Okay? The exports a year ago, I don't know what the data is for 2025, 2024, was over 50 billion in 10 years, 9 years actually, because he used the money, the value chain now. He didn't have the expertise. He basically said, who wants to come? It was mostly Chinese. But the point was, they have created $50 billion worth of exports in 9 years, which used to be 4.9 billion. And that's what productive investment and work can do. But the key on just monetary policy, from my understanding, the US could have quantitative easing and write checks to distressed tiny companies like General Motors because they were writing it in their own currency, number 1. Number 2, the use of the currency, the use of that was monitored. And they basically said, that's why if you remember in 2009, when the CEOs of General Motors, Ford, and what was then Chrysler went to Washington to beg Congress for the money, they were told, oh, you want money? You're going to fly in your private jet. For appearances, they all drove from Detroit to DC because they said, we can't exactly go ask money while we fly in our private jets. But they basically had financial targets, full payment targets, and frankly, for most of them, they were paid back within 5-6 years. So there were consequences and performance targets to that. So the contrary. Dr. Felipe is not saying, so therefore print a lot of money and throw a party. He is not saying that. He is saying print the money for productive and value added and multiplicative purposes. And one way or others, the successful countries did it. The unsuccessful countries wasted it. What did we do? Neither. We just said, never mind. Washington consensus na lang. No more industrialization. Oh, so one more thing. You said about credit ratings. Okay.
Yes.
I was asked this question once, but we have an investment grade credit rating. I said, what does an investment grade credit rating mean? It means you can pay your debt. It doesn't mean you're rich or poor. It is just your credit worthiness, not your wealth. A poor country can be credit worthy and investment grade. A rich country can be in the danger zone. That's why there was a time in the 90s. The UK was on watch list. Nobody's going to say we're poor. And one last thing. I really can't stand it when people say in the 60s we were the second richest country to Japan. My answer is we were the second least poor. Because $200 GDP per capita is not anything to celebrate. It's just that they all became richer. And we became richer, but at a much lower rate.
But I want to ask you also a question, Bella. One of the biggest critics of Karl Marx was that he had no theory of state, and that's why he got Stalinism and all of these horrors that we see today, including Maduro's regime. Right? My sense also right now is what we lack in the debate is why don't we have something like MITI? With all due respect to our DTI folks, why didn't our DTI become even its counterpart in Thailand? And definitely Vietnam and all. So I think one of the things lacking in the debate is why don't we have that revolving door of top-level experts, the University of Tokyo lawyers would end up in the MITI and then do the economics. Why don't we have those group of people who can basically understand development economics, are also decent lawyers, and also care for their country? The absence of that for me, that is one of the missing puzzles, which I find very interesting that my colleagues, political scientists, are not doing a lot of that. They're all into good governance and that. Okay, that's fantastic and great, but I want to see a theory of the state. Why didn't we build a kind of capable, autonomous state with those competent bureaucrats and technocrats who could really focus on industrial policy? Because it's easy to talk about industrial policy, but you cannot have an industrial policy if you don't have a bureaucratic foundation for that can sustain it from one administration to the other, that cannot institutionalize it from one president to the other, that can make a Duterte listen to it and also make a Pinoy listen to it and BBM listen to it. We got people who were very effective to a certain degree. I could say if you look at the past 3 administrations in terms of what they call the macroprudential policy. On that, I think there is some continuity. But that's obviously not enough. If anything, some of us would argue that has been in fact counterproductive. Exactly. So I think that's one of the missing things and one of my disappointment in the Philippines. That's the other missing debate. Why don't we have the bureaucratic or the state capacity foundations for creating that industrial policy? Because Jesus, I completely agree with you. We have so much more room for doing so much more. But you need the people to think along those lines and capable of those things and also care actually about the country. Otherwise, we won't get productive deficit spending, we'll get mumbo-jumbo deficit spending. And this is where I understand where the moralistic arguments come from, because this idea is that do we even have people in the state, in the government, in the BSP, in the DTI, etc., who we can trust with this much power? But my problem is that, as Reagan said, trust but verify. If we don't have that initial trust in the government, if we do not invest in the capacity of the state, if we do not even try to have an industrial policy, good luck. You can check the long conversation I, Lela, and Dr. Belli had on this. We don't see this current political economy as sustainable. AI is going to decimate the low end kind of business process outsourcing we're going to have. I don't know until when can we rely on remittances, especially with the explosion of anti-immigration and nationalization, including the Middle East, where millions of our folks are employed there. I just don't see until when can we just rely on retail and all of these low-end services and industries, which clearly are not creating, forget about just 4,900, just quality growth. You don't have quality growth and quality employment. There's so much gig economy and precarity embedded in our economy. So this is why I wanted to have this kind of conversation. We can have a debate about whether this is modern monetary theory. We can debate about this experience in Indonesia or not. But I think what we cannot deny is that we never had proper debate about all of these different elements that are clearly missing in our national discussion on development. And with that, I'll leave it to Leloy to kind of give his concluding statement because I want to open it up to discussion. I'm sure Jesus really got the ball rolling. Many people have questions on that.
Just very quickly, investment grade is a good idea, but that assumes you get investment.
Investment,
Right? I love it. Have you seen Stevie's interviews? Like he shocks the people who interview him because they're always asking him questions about investment. You know, Stevie, what this do for investment? Well, that do for investment. And he just goes, what investment? Right? Because it's true. Our investment is half, or sometimes it's half, sometimes it's a third of the ASEAN average. That's how bad our investment is. So before we talk about investment grade, let's talk about getting the investment in. But to this point of why we don't have a MITI, well, number one, this was shown that our TTI is severely underfunded relative to other agencies and severely underfunded relative to other countries that fund industry. So this is the funding for MITI in Japan. This is the funding for equivalent agencies in places like Vietnam. I once asked a senator, you know, if you were to legislate something for the TTI, what would your top legislation be? And the answer I got, this was a great senator, by the way, I got a disposition about Secretary Pascual, who was here. That's not how you talk about the TTI. That's not how you talk about TTI policy. So why don't we have that robust system that created the MITI? Because the developmental state, if you look at it, part of it actually looks corrupt. So how does the MITI work? The MITI works like this. At least at its high point in the 1970s, you would graduate from Todai Law, Tokyo Law. You would be employed if you were on top of your class. You would be employed by MITI. You'd be paid a lot, and then afterwards, because you were a part of MITI, and because Mitsubishi and all the Zaibatsu are close to MITI, you would get what's called amakudai in these companies, and you would get paid a lot there also. And there would be a blurring of the kind of interests of the industrialists, the Zaibatsu, and the MITI. Now, when that works, that's called the developmental state. When that falls apart, that's called crony capitalism. Right? And I think it's because we are uncomfortable with these alternative arrangements that we don't advocate for that. The second reason why we don't have that is I think we threw the baby out with the bathwater. Who was the president who promised industrialization, who promised industrial policy? It was Ferdinand Marcos. Right? Whether we like it or not, that was his policy. How did that end? That ended with the 83 to 86 crisis, which was the worst crisis we had since the Second World War. So understandably, everybody is scarred by the Marcos experience. And so the left is scarred by the Marcos experience, the right is scarred by the Marcos experience. If you look at the 1993 central bank policy, which basically says that the central bank cannot do any developmental spending, it cannot do any developmental spending. The sponsor of that law, Raul Rojo, said that this is so uncontroversial that I have the support of the bankers and the Freedom from Debt Coalition, which means there was a left-right consensus against the developmentalism of the central bank when they passed a law in 1993. You should read Raul Rojo's speech. It's really fascinating. So when everybody agrees by virtue of the trauma of the Marcoses, that kind of expansive monetary policy is bad, right? And I was just like, this is kind of silly, but who reads Ambayan, the Communist Party newspaper? I do, right? Ambayan, the Communist Party of the Philippines newspaper, just this week they were complaining about the deficit of the Philippine government. When you have the Communist Party, talking exactly like the UP School of Economics economists, right? They sound exactly the same thing.
Something wrong.
There's something wrong because our imaginations are that constrained. So that's how I answer the question.
Those are
It is a kind of
yeah.
it is poor imagination. We're not ambitious enough.
Can we freeze it there?
Yeah.
This is there'll be question for sure. You can you put them together? Are there any? I'm sure that people are saying,
Well, we
who
have
are
some
these
kind
poor
of
people?
finance,
Exactly.
planning
Like
and trade
we are
industry
like, who are these
secretary.
poor people just pontificating? How dare they? What do they know? Especially those two in the middle
Yeah.
who seem to have zero experience in government. do we have other like alternative experiences, points of view? We're more than welcome. This is a safe space. As I said, I was glad that Jesus had this concerto moment to really explain to us how this system, this monetary policy works.
Correct the impression that we don't have an industrial policy.
Yes, Secretary,
That's the
please.
first thing I developed, in my first 2 years in DTI.
Perfect.
I'm fortunate that you have not read the published.
I saw it, sir. I saw it, sir. I saw it.
Then you'll be something. Okay. Now, but it's also true what you said that DTI has the lowest budget among the line agencies. And you know why I'm here now. Uh, for example, we have very clear national policy, which we had to develop before we were able to develop our export policy. We can only export what we can produce. Okay, and all those things that I've been coordinating with Indonesia, my counterpart. They're encouraging us to follow their path. But how can you let the stronger lobbies towards
Right.
exporting just
Raw.
raw
Yeah.
resources, raw minerals? Before our mountains got deleted, exporting lots. Okay, easiest way for people to make money. Whereas going into manufacturing does a lot of work. I've been talking about industrial policy since I was UP president. In fact, I wrote a paper on that and gave it to President Duterte.
Yeah.
But nobody could implement it, the cabinet at that time. Okay, so I joined the government, trying to implement our industrial policy. And to some extent, we were able to gain headway, but limited. Okay, for example, further processing of agricultural output. I was able to get an additional allocation.
Right.
All of a sudden, when the budget document came out, the money is not in my control. It's allocated to the congressional districts. Okay. So, I mean, it's a long story. I don't think, but if you want to see the real picture, I could have a conversation.
No,
But definitely we have an industrial policy, okay, that drives our export policy. And at the time I left, I was able to accumulate a pipeline of $76 billion of investment on leads and pledges.
Thank you, Secretary. I think we'll go to the steel industry and other people also on the ground. I think the other thing I wanted to add is we also need to create a constituency, because you talked about the lobby for people who want to keep us at this level of exporting. So that's why we need to create this discussion, so create the constituency and the lobbying for that. Because at the end of the day, politicians are going to respond to the lobby. And I think one of the missing elements is why isn't there a strong lobby for a kind of a developmental, proactive industrial policy? And we can have a long conversation in what happened in Indonesia and other countries move in the right direction. Do we want to say, from the steel industry?
Well, I won't talk about steel. No? It's about talking about ourselves. But I'd like to give a view from the private sector on industry policy. When you look at the largest companies, take the top 1,000, which LaSalle did a pretty good job. You'll see that the largest companies are manufacturers actually.
Right.
In fact, roughly about 30% of manufacturers of top 1,000 are manufacturers. Who are they selling it? Denise and Shell, Petrol. So no doubt, a manufacturer can be very big in the economy, and they are. Total gross value added of Philippine manufacturing is about 4 trillion pesos. It's bigger as ever. However, is that the right number for us? So I've been in manufacturing for almost 40 years, chemical, now steel. And the companies that have prospered in spite of lack of industry policy. No? We operate in an environment where there's zero tariff versus imported material, and yet we're able to produce. No, so yes, it's possible, but it's not enough. So I think it's really enlightening that after 3 4 decades, there's more voice. And interestingly, the voice didn't start here. The voice started with Trump, with
Yeah.
I mean, defending their own economy, and it's now okay to talk about IP. 5 years ago, you cannot speak to IP. Recently, even World Bank and IMF is talking about industry policy. It's amazing. They couldn't pronounce it well, but they are starting to talk about it. Now, now, here's the last point. Because it hasn't been exercised for so long, companies don't know what to ask for. In the same time, policymakers don't know what to provide.
Yes.
I was with the FPF for a very long time. And the ones who know what to ask for are the 70, 80-year-old, the old industrialists. Say, oh, Bobby, long time ago, dapat may ganito, ganito, ganito. I said, wow, that's not possible. But that's what they know. Unfortunately, a lot of these industrialists are not around anymore. So we have to relearn. And maybe the answers are not the same answers we had in the 70s and 80s. But we have to work both government, private sector to know what are exactly the things that we know. And it's not the usual ITH. It's not just fiscal incentives. No, it's not. It's much more aggressive than that. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you. This is fantastic. I mean, your point is there. I was literally at the meeting the other year, and actually, you have to give credit to them before to Trump, because the Japanese came up with the concept of national economic security. And you can see it's the national economic security logic that is driving the industrial policy discourse in all major cap. In short, if we don't do it, China will eat us alive, right? On the military front, on the economic front. So that's a very, very important thing. And I really suggest people also to check the works of Danny Roderick, who wrote something about industrial policy for 21st century. The old style of we're just gonna make 10 different 12 industries a la Marcos, that's not gonna work in the 21st century. You have to find a niche, focus on that, be more collaborative. He's exactly saying the things you're saying, and then concentrate and be very performance based, not just throw money after something that's not going to work. Yes, Secretary. Yes, please. Yeah, I just needed to. Please.
Just going back to basics before we talk about.
I think this one works better.
Just going back to basics even before we talk about industrial policy. Basically, if you want to grow, you need investments. That's very basic. And to get investments, there are two variables that we know in corporate finance.
Right.
Control the risk and make the returns attractive. To make the returns attractive, keep costs under control. So basically, that means we have to reduce the risk to businessmen here. Second, we have to keep the cost of business low as much as possible. Where are we? High cost of power, high cost of transport. We have the highest cost of what do you call this? Container handling. We have for a long time we had a very restrictive airline policy, and so forth and so on. And why are these costs high and the risk high and the cost high also? Basically, we cannot ignore political economy. The Philippines is an oligarchic state, multi-capitalistic state, as mentioned by Paul Hutchcroft. And the multi-capitalists and oligarchs, they finance elections, and after the candidates win, they control policies. Why is it that we haven't opened up open access telecom for a very, very long time? So it's only now that they started opening up, but for years it was somebody's happening to the Senate. In other words, our policies restrict investments. Okay. In other words, if you want to grow, we need investments. We have to spend right, both for government and public sector. And Dr. Felipe is correct. We have all the money to spend. The Polish Congress, we save 1 trillion a year from corruption and expenses. But even if they control their greed, we already have enough money. How much they put for the port parallel in the last but 400 billion. 100 billion alone is enough to spend for all the laptops and the tablets that we need for the school children. Another 100 billion for all the classrooms. Another 100 billion to feed all the starving children because they go to school hungry. if BSP just stops this 50 billion very wasteful, what do you call this, complex in Clark, we can build hundreds of thousands of schools, and we're not doing it. And if the Senate did not spend 35 billion on their ego trip building, we could build another 60,000 schools. We have the money. And Dr. Felipe is correct. We have the money. We just know where to spend it. And if the politicians moderate their greed. Another is that the Philippines corruption in the Philippines is unique. I remember reading 20 years ago or 30 years ago a study by a Chinese scholar. A lady scholar, I remember. The Philippines is no more corrupt than other countries. In one country, I will not mention which country because the ambassador may be here. Just give a general 20% of your company. You're taken care of. You have nothing else to worry about. In China, at that time, the lady said it's even more corrupt than the Philippines at that time, 30 years ago. But in China, corruption is well coordinated. Horizontal coordination, if you bribe DTI, you have no problem with DNR, you have no problem with other agencies. Horizontally coordinated. Vertically coordinated. You bribe the boss, all the subordinates will have to follow. And intertemporally coordinated, because if you bribe the predecessor, the successor also stays bribed. In the Philippines, no matter how many you bribe, the one who keeps the bribe money doesn't get the results. It increases the risk of doing business.
Okay.
In other words, focus on,
Jesus, you want to
before
respond
even
to
talk
that
about
first?
industrial policy,
No,
focus on
something else.
risk and return. Controlling the cost of doing business and reducing the risk of doing business.
But I can
But
respond to this.
these issues are also related to the fact that you're an oligarchic state.
Yes, sir. May I respond to this
Thank you
idea of oligarchy? So it's actually really difficult to measure oligarchy, but The Economist has a crony capitalism index, and we've actually been dropping the crony capitalism index. And if crony capitalism / oligarchic democracy is the reason why we're poor, how come Malaysia, Singapore, and Hong Kong all rank higher than us on the crony capitalism index? The other thing about the crony capitalism / oligarchic democracy explanation is the reason why we think we're exceptional in that regard is because of the way Americans have told our history. So who you first use the term crony capitalism or oligarchic democracy, where does this come from? The first scholars who used this term were actually American imperialists like Governor General Leonard Wood. And the reason why he used that term is because he did not want to give Filipinos independence. So what did he say? All of these people who were actually trying to industrialize the country, people like Manuel Quezon, Sergio Osmeña, they were oligarchs and they were crony capitalists. And in my research, I showed that many of those observations were actually empirically incorrect. And what we've done is that actually we have believed the colonial archive. And because we believe the colonial archive, we have such a low regard for ourselves. We're still perpetuating this idea that the Americans created, that we are a hopeless, crony capitalist society. We are not. What we are saying here is that we should be giving ourselves a little bit of grace. Is there crony capitalism? Yes. But as Jesus said, anybody at our level of development is going to have that. Right? We shouldn't scold ourselves for this because this is the developmental path that everyone's going through. And the moment, sir, let me finish, sir.
We let you finish. Let him finish.
Sure, let me finish, sir. And I think if we say that we are a hopeless crony capitalist state and that we are hopelessly corrupt, what is the solution to that? Is it an anti-dynasty law? Is it tinkering the margins? No, if we say we're hopeless, the solution is a Deus Ex Machina like Duterte, right? You are asked, by saying you are hopeless, you're asking for authoritarianism, right? And I think that, and so that we have created our own problem-solution mismatch. If we are hopeless, then the solution should be extreme. But I don't think we are hopeless, and I don't think the solutions are extreme. I think the solutions are better financing and industrial policy.
I didn't say crony capitalism. I said oligarchic capitalism.
We're saying the same thing, okay? I think you made your point. Now, I want to say something related to what Leloy said, because I've been to the other Asian countries. They're just as oligarchical as us. But two things. One, they're more progressive and they're more horizontally integrated and doing things which are value added versus us. Now, let's go what's considered the great success in the country, which I think is ephemeral, BPOs. All right? You look at the first generation. PLDT was in it, Ayala was in it, other major companies were in it. Why is it now all foreigners here? Versus in India, you have to go beyond the top 20 to find a foreign-owned BPO in size. Here, you won't find a single Filipino-owned BPO that's top 20. Why? Because the oligarchs, to use the frame, or the big people, can actually still make more money in their legacy businesses where they have huge market shares, whether it's real estate, banking, malls, whatever, than the difficult business of something new and export oriented and competitive like BPOs. So, what is maybe a corollary solution besides making the oligarchs be more broad rather than focus and protecting their market share in their industries? It's what you just said, industrial policy and developmental finance. In other words, to the people who are willing to do the hard work, whether it's steel, whether it's assembly, whether it's further processing of minerals or everything, then give the developmental capital to the people who are qualified. And it's not going to be 1960s where I'm just going to give it to you and close the market to other people. You're going to make them earn it. You're going to have benchmarks and so on. And then you might have the beginnings. Now, I'm going to say one more thing. I'm tired of this magical thinking and magical solutions that everybody thinks. You look at basically Nehru. In 1950, he started the Indian Institute of Technology. You read the commentary at the time, people were laughing at him practically in racist terms, like how dare these Indian people think they can become the great engineers and technology experts 4 years after independence. Now you tell me how many of the Magnificent Seven are not run by Indians in one of the three positions. But that took 70 years. So enough of this magical thinking that I remember so many times I give speeches and people tell me, what can we do in the short term? And I said, stop thinking in the short term. That's what we can do. Because short term is for emergency. Long term is to fix problems, or else the short term solutions will just create more problems. So it's painful. It takes time. It's not easy. But the alternative is worse. Now, we have to have expectations where we don't expect, I do this, and tomorrow I will see the result. The result will come in your children's time if everybody keeps at it. As I said, look at the Indian Institute of Technology and the Instant Institute Bank. Okay? You want to think it's just BPOs? JP Morgan just said, because of the difficulties in getting H1s now in the US, they're all moving to Bangalore. JP Morgan has 600,000 plus employees. And they said, 300,000 plus. And they said 22% of our employees globally are now in India doing credit analysis, doing modeling. So it's not customer service. No, it's basically serious stuff. Our top three banks, BPI, BDO, and Metro Bank, the top three employ less than that. JP Morgan alone has more employees in India than the total employees of BPI, BDO, and Metro Bank. That's what happens when you focus, quality, and niche goals. India's not trying to do everything China can do or the US can do or everything. But it's what you said, focus, development, but they keep at it. And I remember let's just say my father had a much easier life than me. And when I came back here in 1989, he said, I'm joining buying Venezuela PCI, I was going to run PCI Capital under him. And my father said to me, Stevie, you're doing investment banking? I said, yeah. That's hard. If you have that mentality, yeah, it will be hard. Industrial policy is hard. Becoming successful is not preordained. Again, you don't wish your way to success. You earn, adapt, and continue your way to success. It's going to take long. It's not going to be easy.
Thank you. Jesus, you want to respond?
No, not respond. you want to
Go first.
You go first, and I'll go. Even though the comments, it's not exactly response,
Yeah.
elaboration.
Thank you. Let me start with the observation that there's a growing consensus that we must be serious about having an adaptable industrial policy. The other that I observed from Richard is the recurring concern of Filipinos that quality of wages should be continuously addressed, especially in bureaucracy. No? Fortunately, I was in institutions in government that had a different bureaucratic structure, which is not the norm. The norm, I guess, is that many of these institutions, especially the implementing agencies, are unfortunately not in a position to absorb the resources that are provided by the government. And I'd like to go into that area, Professor, because unfortunately I'm a product of conventional thinking in the past, early 70s or late 60s.
Not after today.
Not yet. That's why
Thank you.
it's taking me a little time to absorb or
We can talk.
understand your theory or your no, well, that's not a theory, but your explanation. I'm a product of conventional thinking that we should spend, but properly spend, and that there should be some limit to our spending, and that we should also make sure that the people who are receiving the resources are going to spend it properly, and that resources are really scarce. But you said that this is not the case. So I was just trying to figure out how your position, how this would be translated actually when you try to bring this up to policymakers. These are realities that we have to go through. A reality that I also experienced when I was a student of economics, and then entering Congress, I thought that we could still apply and get the first and second best solution. But later on, I had this reality that a sixth or seventh best solution is something that we just have to accept because we don't have a critical mass of policymakers who had the same or similar thinking. But anyway, we should try to make sure that we can really absorb, because what's important is if your position is really correct, how do we then translate that? How do we have a critical mass of policymakers that can appreciate what you're saying? When the conventional thinking up to now, I think, is that we should try to live within our means, or is a developing country not to go beyond 3% of the GDP for fiscal deficit, and we should manage our national debt. So I'd like to ask the professor how we can navigate this among policymakers now and get this adopted in a way that you envision it. Thank you.
Can I?
Yeah, Jesus, and I think we can wrap up if that's the, I suppose, yeah.
Thank you so much. I just elaborate on a couple of points, and I really appreciate on the comments. I want to start with Eloy, because Eloy was talking about the Central Bank Act. That's the 7653. We were talking about the same thing. It explicitly prohibits the central bank from financing the treasury, comma, except in exceptional circumstances. Very clear. Is anybody here aware of what happening? Yes, Secretary.
I have drafted that 7653.
Say it again.
Drafted.
Yes, I have drafted bill, and the one in the Senate was sent from the legislature no longer.
Okay.
Rob.
And it was very, very explicit. Our intention was to separate
Sure.
central bank function from national government function. Central bank was never meant to be the banker with the national government. And you just mentioned the right thing. Central bank can only lend the national government under extreme circumstances. It has to be paid within 60 or 90 days.
What I was going to ask you is, if you know, when the central bank did what implicitly we're saying, doing developmental economics, very recently, COVID, suddenly, you know how much money directly the central bank gave to Treasury? One of you must remember, because I'm sure that you got the bills at home asking you to return the money. 300 billion peso. Where did the 300 billion peso come from? Look at heaven. Ex nihilo. It was an internal operation. I have a paper on that doing also the T accounts between Treasury and the BSP. None of us knows. That was done. It was done. All we are saying is, but say openly that that's what you are doing already, and use it for what we call nation building. That is the first point. Okay. The second one is, Secretary was saying that we need to deal with the cost of doing business. Absolutely correct. But one of the things that we show in the book is because this is a constant and recurrent argument, particularly by businessmen, the private sector. I don't know exactly what you mean by the cost of doing business, so we went to the World Bank Index, which is the index most widely used. So what we did was to compare not the Philippines with those who are better than us. It has a selection bias, but against the whole world. And the Philippines, in the terms of the cost of doing business, is exactly on average. On average. Once you take out all the advanced economies, that you would say do better, and indeed they do better, the Philippines is to the right, meaning the Philippines does better than the average developing country. So the cost of doing business here, unless you get obsessed with comparing yourself with the countries in the region that do better, on average. On average. Not only that, the cost of doing business is an index of 10 indicators. The Philippines is really relatively bad in one or two of them. The others, better than the average of the world. Not only that, one needs to prove to me, and it's very, very difficult, that the fact that it takes in, let's say, Malaysia, 1 week to open a business, and in the Philippines 2 months, is the reason for having $4,500 per capita. And you're going to have a trouble. Okay? Third point is just a couple of clarifications. Can I ask you to please stop calling debt debt? Why don't you call it wealth of the private sector? and stop with the obsession of is 60%. Is the ratio is meaningless. It's meaningless. Why 60%? Because it was imposed on the developing countries by the IMF. That's what it is. Not for any other particular reason. Okay? I already explained it. How do we pay debt? The same way. BSP simply, clicks the computers and enter. You were saying, Steve, that the difference with Japan is that is domestic debt. The same as in the Philippines. 70% is domestic debt.
Yeah, but I'm saying when you go beyond the margin.
But what is the
we got
margin?
we got into trouble in the 80s.
No.
Because of 27 billion of foreign debt.
Foreign debt, no pesos.
Yeah, but still foreign. You had to pay it back in dollars.
Yeah. No, that's what I'm saying. We agree.
Yeah.
The problem in the 1980s was dollars.
Exactly.
What is the morale? What is the morale? Don't get dollars unless you strictly need them, and you need to tell me why you would need them.
Because
we
we
go back
have
to the
no
point.
manufacturing capacity, so we have to import those versus
Exactly.
make it domestically.
And that is what you have, what we call the balance of payments constraint growth rate. That our growth rate is constrained by exactly that. So the story goes well. But let's differentiate. What happened in the 1980s was that the debt was dollars. That cannot be the problem today. 70% of the debt is in pesos. That is today. Again, also, please, let's stop using the term printing money. Money is not printed. Money is created. And there are two main sources of money creation. One is the one I told you, the bank, the government. That happens to be the small one of the two. What is the main source of money creation in any economy today? The commercial banking sector. When the banks lend. Is there any banker here, for God's sake? When banks lend, they are creating money. That is the main source of money creation in an economy. It's not the government printing, which most of the money is not printed. It's simply electronic transfers. So I think the proper term is to call it money creation. Okay. And the final point is, Secretary, what is the limit on our spending? Can I get back to you with a question? You tell me what nation do we want. You want to eliminate malnutrition? Yes or no?
We need to do that.
You want it? Spend on that.
We need to spend.
You want to have all our kids schooled with the excellent public education? spend on that.
Especially from 0 to 2000.
You want to have an excellent health system. Why our health system, public health system, cannot be like the one in Spain, where I'm from? Why not? How is it possible that in the year 2025, morally and ethically, we accept malnutrition when we know how to get rid of that? The school meals. How much does a school meal cost? Zero. The bank, we pay that way for it. What is the real cost? Companies producing resource meals, meals for children. That is the cost. So we need a company in the food sector making meals, and another company in the plastic sector making trays, and another company in the metal sector making forks. That is the cost, and that is how countries develop, and that is the limit to our spending. You tell me the nation that we want, because there is only one agent that is really, but because we all blame that agent, is the government can do that. Only the government is responsible for development. We all make the government responsible for development, not the private sector.
Mrs. May, I support you on that. I look at the corporate finance examples.
Can you speak with the mic, secretary?
Yeah.
Romy.
Let me support in that basis. Although I don't agree with your with the national government and the relationship with the central government. It needed, we have to review the national central
We should
government.
have a separate
And also
panel.
again, 7653. I have drafted with Romo. Anyway, I would like to support you on there's enough money to spend. Okay? Because if you look at corporate finance, corporations always do deficit spending. That's why they keep on borrowing and borrowing to expand. No, wait. The important thing is to spend right and not to waste that money. Because if the corporation spends right and it is a positive NPV, the stock prices go up. They can borrow all they want as long as they spend well. Same thing with government. We're not spending well, we're just wasting away the money through corruption and wasteful spending. That's why I'm thinking we have a need with this 50 billion central bank building. Total waste of money. How many school buildings can you do with that? And also the 35 billion just spent on the center. Total waste of money.
With due respect, I think we can continue this. Probably we need another panel discussion. Right? This was supposed to just open the discussion rather
I
than.
was just supporting.
Yeah, but we're
Yes,
not closing
thank you so
the
much.
discussion. We're closing
This can continue after this formally. Thank you so much again. We really appreciate the feedback from people who are in the policy making world. Indeed, as I mentioned a while ago, we need to create a constituency for industrial policy or whatever you want to call it, the developmental approach to policy making and all of that. And I think our good friend Dr. Felipe has learned even more when it goes back to our officials in the Congress and all. But to wrap this up, I'll leave it to Lelo because it's really your book and discussion around your books and your fight with some of our friends in UP School of Economics that got all of this thing started in one way or another.
Yeah, so I'm a historian. If you look at the economic history of the Philippines, it's a history of palusot. We never do industrial policy because we always have an history. So when did our economy really start? During the galleon trade. We were a hub for the transportation of goods from China to the New World. Did we really make any money from that? We didn't make any money. We made money because the Spanish government, because they love the galleon trade so much, gave us a subsidy called the Real Situado, and we thought that was enough. Right? And then when the Americans arrived, we made another palusot. We didn't engage in industrial policy. Why? Because they gave us free trade agreement. So we said, okay, our exports are going to be okay because we're just going to trade with the United States. Palusot again, right? When in the 20th century, we could have built an industrial policy, but we're like, yeah, we speak English. We'll just have call centers instead. We made another palusot. We keep, and at one point, we're going to run out of palusot. The current palusot that we have is that we can't engage in industrial policy because we have an oligarchy. That's another palusot, because how do you solve the problem of the oligarchy? Number one, all countries have oligarchies. But then the people who are making palusot say, well, our oligarchy sucks, so we can't engage in industrial policy. How do you make the oligarchy better? It is through an active government. So I'll give you an example. How did LG become LG? LG was kind of oligarchic also. They were rent-seeking. That's what oligarchs do, right? They were asking the government for benefits. The Korean government went up to LG and said, you want to rent-seek? You want something from us? Give us something in return. You want kuryente? That's what they were asking for. You need to transition from non-manufacturing to manufacturing. And that's why you have the LG of today. So the oligarchs are going to rent-seek, Don't use that as an excuse to not engage in industrial policy. Tell them you want something from me. I will demand something back from you.
Democratically.
Democratically, of course, but the government has the power to do that. So here is why we need to stop making palusot, because we can't let our politics get in the way of the need to build our economy. So let's reverse the burden. Instead of walang korap, walang mahirap, let's say, kung mabawasan ng kahirapan, mababawasan ang korap. Instead of saying, sa gobyerno tapat angat buhay lahat, you need to say that pag angat buhay lahat, ang gobyerno ay mas nagiging tapat. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you very much. You're free to ask our panelists on the side if they're still sticking around. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this evening. That was
That was a tour de force.
so feel free to